without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Soji. And our first question is really an explanation of what does alcohol do to a fetus?
Okay. Thank you again, Andrew, for this opportunity. And I welcome everybody to this forum. It's really great to have you. Alcohol, really, the form that we tend to consume as human beings is ethanol. And ethanol is one of those chemicals that really gets very easily into the body and into different parts of the body because it has this unique ability to dissolve both in water and in fats. And that's really, when you take a drink of alcohol, you notice very quickly it goes to your head, and that's because it's very, very dissolvable. Now, in the fetus, unlike a grown adult, there are mechanisms through which alcohol can be easily broken down, and so the effect of it can be mitigated. But in the fetus, those mechanisms have not really fully developed. So whatever the amount of alcohol is in the mother's blood is what actually ends up in the baby. And those effects really are what we see as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So when we talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we're really talking about physical and neurodevelopmental problems that ensue as a result of alcohol damaging the brain and other organs. So let's not forget that there are other organs that can be damaged, but we're focusing really primarily on the damage to the brain and the central nervous system. And there are many ways in which alcohol does that. And I should emphasize is alcohol really is broken down in the body into different metabolites and into different chemicals. And one of those chemicals can be something called acetaldehyde. And that chemical in itself can alter the way in which genes are switched on. So there are crucial stages within the development of the fetus, which certain genes have to be switched on for certain parts of the brain and certain parts of organs to develop. And alcohol can disturb that. And there's research that has shown that. There's also research that has shown that alcohol can disrupt the way in which cells migrate from one part of the developing brain to another. And so you can start to see the makings of the kind of structural abnormalities that you can get with alcohol. There are problems with the gray matter and the white matter. And so you can have structural abnormalities like what we call the corpus callosum, which is a part of the brain where connections are made with the right and the left side of the brain are connected together. Alcohol can disrupt the formation of that. Alcohol can also disrupt in the way in which the control of nerve cells are made so that they actually die prematurely. And that's a process called apoptosis. And anyone who's sort of in the medical field or scientists will know that means that the cell is programmed to die. And that's a premature death of the cell in this case. That could actually explain why the brain volume of individuals with the most severe end of the spectrum of FASD is actually small. And that can also reflect, how they present, because we often measure the sizes of their hair. So there are many ways in which, alcohol can affect the fetus. And one other way that I haven't mentioned is it can actually affect the way in which nutrients are transferred from the fetus from the mother to the fetus via the placenta. So it disturbs the way in which the placenta functions, and that in itself can affect how the fetus grows in general. So and one of the ways in which we know about of which we assess for fetal alcohol spectrum is also assessing the size of the child. So there are many mechanisms through which alcohol can cause fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
A lot of people refer to the facial stigmata, and a lot of doctors that aren't familiar with diagnosis or are not familiar with FASD, they refer and they look for a sign that they can latch onto, and the facial stigmata, the facial features are those. Now, I know in the last webinar, Roger mentioned these. Can you go into a little bit of detail about when do they develop? And it's just a very small window, isn't it? Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I'll preface that by saying as doctors, and particularly as developmental doctors, we're always looking for the physical. And so we're very much drawn to that aspect, but it only accounts for, 5 at most 10% of children with FASD do actually have physical signs or physical features like that. It is generally accepted, really, in research that the time of fetal development where the face is forming is really within what's called the embryonic phase, and that's really between the 2nd and 9th week. So well within the 1st trimester is where the face is forming. Now, when alcohol disrupts or when alcohol is consumed at significant enough amounts, that is when you can get facial abnormalities or facial changes or facial differences. And those kind of facial differences are, the size of the eyes being quite small, the philtrum, which is the sort of ridge between the nose and the upper lip, and the smooth upper lip. So it's actually been shown in studies that that window of time is actually the first 9 weeks, essentially, well within the 1st trimester. And that is the only kind of physical sign that you can date to that degree of accuracy. All the other features of FASD, that you can't date them in that way, because alcohol affects brain development right through gestation.
Thank you. It's cleared up that one for a lot of people, I know. Now, the real crux of what we need to be talking about as well is, why is diagnosis so important for our individuals with FASD?
That is a big question, but it's a very, very important question, because for so long, some of us and some within my field have had the argument, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so why diagnose it? But actually, a lot of research is now showing that there's a great deal of value in early identification, early diagnosis of individuals with FASD. When you diagnose someone with FASD, you actually have an opportunity to then start to put in supports. And the way that diagnosis is evolving at the moment is looking very carefully at different domains of development. Now, when you start to look at that level of detail, you can start to now see, if a child is diagnosed with FASD, you can now start to see what kind of cognitive problems do they have and how to address that. What kind of language problems do they have? How do you address that? What kind of behavioral problems do they have? So you can start to build a picture which allows you to support an individual. And at the end of the day, we're talking individuals here, because each person that's affected by FASD is an individual. So early intervention can only happen with early diagnosis. It's not really efficient to put in any kind of intervention without knowing what you're dealing with. And really, the other issue is that we know that there's a lot of information, particularly in America and other parts of the Western world, of how much cost there is involved in individuals who have FASD that were not picked up. The prison population, for example, studies have shown that a very significant number, when you actually study them carefully, will fulfill a diagnosis for FASD. So on a population basis, there is a real benefit to actually identifying these individuals early, so that you can put in the intervention and then avert a lot of problems down the line. And we talk about, in this field, we're talking about secondary effects. We talk about the fact that individuals with FASD are more vulnerable, to exploitation. They're more vulnerable to mental health problems. They're more vulnerable to suicide. They're more vulnerable to adverse life events. So it actually is so important that we catch them early, because the earlier we can make the diagnosis, the quicker we can put in interventions that actually make a difference. And there is a lot of body of evidence that actually, even at primary school level, there's a lot of information out there of what you can do for children who have been diagnosed at a very young age. So it is no longer an excuse to say that there isn't any intervention out there. And in fact, the more we diagnose children, actually the more intervention will develop. So you're actually creating demand for which supply can then follow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It brings up the very interesting question and controversial question, as what age would you start looking at diagnosing for FASD? Because at the moment, the clinics are diagnosing the multidisciplinary approach. They only start at 6 years old. At what age could you get a diagnosis for FASD?
That's a very interesting question. I think what we have to appreciate is that each individual is going to be different. And what we also have to appreciate is that the quality of diagnosis also relies on the quality of information that you get. So if you are, if you have a young person who there's a strong history or significant or reliable history of alcohol exposure prenatally, then at really whatever age you can start to look at assessing an individual. And the current guidelines actually make a lot of allowances. It doesn't really prescribe when you can start, because theoretically a baby could be born sadly and they could have facial features or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or fetal alcohol syndrome, and you'll be able to diagnose them at that stage because of that. If they don't have any facial features and maybe a toddler is presenting, actually on the basis of really careful history gathering, and there's some of the some of the assessment that you can do actually can help you make a diagnosis. So you can make a diagnosis before the age of 6. 6 tends to be the age that is very much out there, because a lot of the standardized tests that you would use, psychological testing and cognition testing, really sort of start at that kind of age. But you can make a diagnosis earlier than that, depending on the quality of information that you have.
Excellent. At the moment, who can assess for FASD? Who diagnoses? What's the process that one would, if you suspect, for example, or if, let's say, an adoptive parent has some evidence that the birth mother consumed alcohol during pregnancy, or a foster placement, something's just, there's some evidence there that they were drug or alcohol takers, or even that they suspect something. Where would you go with that information? Okay,
there is the ideal and there is what is happening at the moment. Okay, I'll start with what is happening at the moment, and I think it goes to the heart of what needs to change in our settings across the country and perhaps even across some parts of the world. So at the moment, if you are suspicious of developmental problems, e.g. FASD, you would go to your GP. Your GP will then be obliged to refer you to a developmental pediatrician such as myself. Now, what has happened in the past is that when a developmental pediatrician such as myself has seen a child, we have not been thinking about FASD, but that is changing. Often what will happen if an FASD question is raised is that we will then refer to a clinical geneticist. And a clinical geneticist would then say, oh, okay, well, there's no dysmorphic features, no facial problems, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe they might do 1 or 2 genetic testing, and often it doesn't go anywhere. And really bear in mind that only about 5 to 10% of children will have facial features. So right at the outset, we are not picking up as many as we could. But what is what is the ideal? And this is coming from latest information from places like Canada, who are far ahead of us, and America in the FASD world, is that just like other neurodevelopmental problems that we assess for, like, you know, autism in particular, maybe even ADHD, it should be a multidisciplinary team assessment. So when they see the GP refers to a community pediatrician. A community pediatrician says, well, actually, this is there's a possibility of this. This child then needs to have a wider multidisciplinary assessment. That is what a lot of guidelines are saying, that body of individuals should include either a psychiatrist or a developmental pediatrician, a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, and a clinical psychologist at the core. Now, that is the sort of idealistic sort of setup. But actually, what is emerging now, which makes it even more accessible, is really putting the pediatrician or the psychiatrist right in the center, and actually having an opportunity then to get a clinical psychologist assessment, get a speech and language therapist assessment, and get an occupational, whatever assessment is required, to then go forward and look at the clinical guidelines and come up with a diagnosis. And there's some real exciting work going on at the moment, because quite a lot of the argument against making a proper assessment for FASD has been, well, we don't have the resources. You know, it's so expensive to gather all these sort of specialties together. But actually, there is headway being made in that regard. And generally, I would say that, you know, the future very much is bright. You know, we're having, you know, evenings like this are becoming even more commonplace to actually skill up our developmental and other allied professionals to make diagnosis. So in a direct answer to your question, if you are suspecting that, you know, your child may have FASD, the first port of call generally would be a general practitioner or even a health visitor. And they can then refer to community pediatrics or developmental pediatrician, who can then take things forward. And that's the point where things are now changing. Whereas in the past we would look for a specialist clinic, now we are starting to scale up and actually, you know, start to put diagnoses together ourselves.
That answers the question. A lot of people that come to our support groups say that pediatricians might well say to them that they don't know enough to diagnose for FASD. Can you explain a little bit about the actual process of what you need to be able to get to diagnosis of FASD?
Thank you. So the latest, you know, guidelines that have recently been ratified in Scotland and originally developed in Canada speaks about 10 domains of development, essentially. And that is sort of, this is with the proviso that there is strong enough evidence or strong enough report of prenatal alcohol exposure. So that is quite key. Whether or not there is physical features, and I outlined that earlier on, the 3 physical features about the size of the eyes, the sort of mouth philtrum and the upper lip, thin upper lip. Whether or not those are present, there still needs to be looking at 10 domains, and those domains, of those domains, you only need 3 or more before you can make a diagnosis of FASD. That diagnosis can be FASD with features, physical features, or FASD without physical features. And as I said, you know, over 90% of cases of FASD don't have physical features. So, and those kind of domains, just to give you an idea, there is brain structure. So are there any abnormalities, structural abnormalities in the brain, Is the head circumference small? So are we talking about in a child who has what's called microcephaly? And then there is cognition, and this is a very much a psychological assessment that needs to happen. And if there is significant deficits within that, that is, another one that can form part of the diagnosis. And then there is other areas like attention, affect regulation, so the emotional stability of the child, social communication, how are they with their adaptive skills, and a few others, that make up that 10. And the interesting thing about that is that you don't always need a sort of highfalutin neuropsychiatric assessment, and actually a lot will depend on the experience of the clinician, and so it's important that they get skilled up, but also on one or two sort of allied, like a speech and language therapist, like an occupational therapist, because within that also there is motor. That's quite an important one. There's motor skills as well, which you assess. So, typically, a child with FASD may be dyspraxic. They may have dyspraxia. They may have coordination issues, which you can pick up on physical examination, which you can pick up on occupational therapy assessment. So there are 10 domains, which you need 3 or more of those domains to have a significant level of deficit before you can make a diagnosis of FASD. But just bear in mind that there needs to be a credible report of alcohol exposure during pregnancy, and whether or not there is physical features actually is not integral to the making of the diagnosis.
And this is one of the things that the NICE guidance that will be coming out at some point this year is really pushing to be able to get that evidence, to be able to help early diagnosis and positive outcomes. Now, as part of the process of diagnosing, is there any genetic screening specific to diagnosing for FASD? Genetics is your area of expertise.
I mean, generally, one of the issues that's coming to light, and probably I would say particularly over the last 10, 15 years, is that a huge part of neurodevelopmental expression, even without physical features, can be accounted for by chromosome abnormalities. And one of the game changers over the last 10 years or so is this test called the array CGH, which allows you to look at the whole span of chromosomes. And so really part of the assessment for FASD is also ruling out that there is any sort of chromosome abnormalities. And by chromosome abnormalities, I mean bits of chromosomes or bits of genetic information that could be added on or taken away from the 22 pairs or the 23 pairs of chromosomes that we have. So as part of the assessment, at some points, it would be advisable that a child also has sort of chromosome checks, and whether or not they have any facial features. And there are some genetic abnormalities that can mimic or can look like FASD. So they share features with FASD. And if there are if there are any features that as a clinician you're thinking, well, my knowledge, my developing knowledge of FASD or fetal alcohol syndrome, I can't see this particular feature, then you do need to seek clinical genetics advice about that, just in case there are other things to consider. But I will also add in one thought that we live in the world of comorbidities. Just because you have a chromosome change doesn't mean that you cannot have FASD. So if you have a credible report of alcohol exposure in pregnancy, you can still, assess an individual for FASD, even if there is a chromosome change that you find. So I think, just bear that in mind. It's not an all or nothing thing. So yeah, definitely bear that in mind.
Thank you for that. One of the biggest confusions for doctors, GPs, any medical professional is being able to see past ASD, ADHD, other co-occurring conditions. Now, Raja mentioned that he was one of the first in this country to identify that there are 426 or 423 co-occurring conditions. Can you explain a little bit about how you come to decide it FASD and how it's the umbrella term that we need to be looking at?
Yeah, good question. The interesting thing is that FASD is a broad church, as it were, and you can understand why, because alcohol gets into so many different parts of the processes of the brain. So there's work that has come up which you can start to piece out when it comes to ADHD, which part of the brain is generally affected. So we know, for example, that the frontal lobe, which is where the executive function of the brain is seated, is one of the main sites for ADHD being affected. And we know that there are various other areas that ASD tends to be localized to, in broadly speaking. Now, the interesting thing is that FASD affects all of the different areas that ASD would affect and ADHD would affect. So it tends to be quite a broad spanning set of symptoms and features that you would find. So whereas with ADHD, there are well described a set of, I think if you're talking about inattention, you're talking about maybe about 6 features. If you're talking about hyperactivity and impulsivity, you're talking about 9 features. Whereas with FASD, you have cognitive problems, you have adaptive problems, you have learning problems where an individual finds it difficult, so memory problems where they find it difficult to remember what they've learned, where they might have learned it and then they've forgotten. So really, when you start to see those levels of complexity, then you need to start thinking in broader terms. And many of us will, particularly if you're a developmental pediatrician, or if you're a parent with a child who has been given a diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental problem, you will identify with the kind of cases where it looks like ADHD, but actually there's something else. There's a little bit more that doesn't actually quite fit into that picture. And that for me is sort of the impetus to think, let's think a little bit wider. I mean, one of the things that when I started in the world of developmental pediatrics, was I was always struck by just how many kids I see with small heads. And I would, vigorously try to investigate and try to, do the genetics and things like that. And I'm always left with an unsatisfactory, nothing, we can't find anything. Now, I just wonder, this is my sort of wondering, how many of those children actually may have subtle features, so that if I had taken my history properly, or if I've had, a parent who was able to be candid and I've made the environment candid enough for them to be able to actually, reveal to me about their, the maternal lifestyle, how many of those children actually will have issues or will have been exposed to prenatal alcohol? So really, I mean, when you start to see a broadening of the spectrum, a broadening of the profile of a child, I would say have at the back of your mind that, there is, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder possibility. And when you look closely at the diagnostic criteria, a lot of the features that you see actually also encompass social communication difficulties, which is one of the sort of central areas of autism, attention difficulties, which is one of the central areas of ADHD. So really, it's a kind of neurodevelopmental disorder plus plus. Yes. Is what I would differentiate it.
Thank you for that really thorough answer. One of the questions that we have, because we've got such a vast selection of people on this webinar, from medical professionals, social care professionals, teachers, and parent carers. Each of those have an answer to this next question. And it's, what should I do if I suspect FASD? First of all, if we can answer from the parent or carer's perspective, what should you do if you suspect FASD?
Okay, I think what we appreciate is that quite in this sort of area of neurodevelopmental pediatrics, quite a lot of children will end up in the care system, and so that's a very pertinent question for potential adopters and foster carers. But I would say, write down, start by writing down what your concerns are. Why are you thinking what you are thinking, and as much as you can, find out about the maternal history of the child, that of your child, as it were. Obviously, if you are the birth mother, then it's a different case to if you're not. And I think that's one of the areas that needs to change, in that having that vital piece of information about maternal lifestyle, maternal alcohol consumption. And I think once you have that, I think in this sort of day and age, we are moving gradually. We're taking baby steps away from the stigma, but there is still a lot of stigma out there. But I would say approach your general practitioner, and explain to them why, what your concerns are, and encourage them to refer you to a friendly developmental pediatrician. And I think there's a certain degree of having to be assertive, and having to read, and that's why I said write it down. Yeah. It makes a lot of difference when you can present a coherent argument when you're with a medical professional, to presenting, saying, I think he has it, or I think she has it, and not really presenting why. And you will know in the everyday the kind of things that are happening and the kind of struggles that you're having. And yeah, don't ignore those, write them down. And for a person like myself, I often find it very helpful. And actually, I commandeer whatever parents have written, and I go through it, to sort of get an understanding.
And it works the same, doesn't it, with in teaching staff, because the teaching staff might well have information on the families. The Senkos will have a certain amount of information. They know the families, they talk to the families, so they might well have a better understanding of a medical history there as well. So what would you recommend to some teachers? Because the toughest thing for many of our teachers out there is their basic training. They only have 2 weeks training on disabilities, don't they? So it's a tough one to expect of our teachers.
I think I'll answer that in 2 ways. One is to flag up with the head teacher or whoever is in charge of continuous professional development of teachers, because they are really at the forefront a lot of what we're discussing, both at the diagnostic level and at the interventional level. So there is a real need to skill up our teachers. But I would say that if you are suspicious or you think that a child may have FASD, it is important that you, as a Senko, or as a teacher, you talk to your Senko, and as a Senko, have a discussion with your local developmental pediatrician. And many, developmental pediatricians do work quite closely with schools. A lot will have forums where they discuss, cases that are coming to pediatricians. And I think it warrants a discussion. And when you've, and again, I say, the same thing that I've said about a parent. Write down why you're thinking what you're thinking. The kind of thing that is really helpful for a pediatrician would be not just a kind of how they are doing in terms of their learning achievement, although that is helpful, but also how are they socially, how are they in terms of their behavior, how are they in terms of their adaptability. Sometimes we see a profile where someone with FASD can seem really expressive. Their expressive language is often better than their sort of comprehension. And they may seem clever in one area, but actually you ask them to organize themselves and they fall apart. So those kind of nuances can be really, really helpful. And, as Senkos, you often know a little bit more about the family than a pediatrician might. So if you know about a sibling who has kind of issues, those are the kind of forums you can kind of bring that into the picture, as well. But definitely talk to your pediatrician.
And we're having at the moment, as we're developing our pathway here in the Southeast, certainly at the minute, we've got a lot of schools wanting to upskill their Senkos, and we're offering training on FASD at the moment. Now, in the same way and in the same light, the importance of this early information, your primary healthcare professionals and the health visitors and the GPs, it's so important that they are looking for these pieces of information to document as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it is often said, even within the FASD world, that there is no one single sort of developmental picture or profile that can really make the diagnosis for you. And if you've met a child with FASD or met an individual with FASD, you have met an individual with FASD. But what is absolutely crucial is, trying to define whether or not alcohol played a part, during pregnancy, and that's quite important. Yes, there are profiles that we identify that when we see a child, we can say, that can be a child with FASD because of the kind of cognitive profile they have, because of the kind of affect that they have, because of the kind of social communication sort of difficulties that they have. But a lot of these features can also be mimicked by other things, by other conditions, such as attachment issues, such as, we've mentioned chromosome changes, etc. So as far as it's possible, trying to sort of get that history is important, and that's going to be very important for the future.
Absolutely. I'm very conscious as well at this time that a lot of people are looking for that early evidence, but it's so important to stress, isn't it, as well, that we support the birth mothers that find they've inadvertently been drinking, they didn't know they were pregnant. We've got to get away from this blame culture and stigma to be able to offer the right level of support for these families, because it can happen to anyone, can't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's very easy to think, and you can think of a demographic in your mind as to, the kind of person that drinks alcohol and affect their baby. But actually that could not be further from the truth. Generally, there is this statistic that came out that even, within the middle class or the so-called middle class community, there is a high rate of FASD because individuals don't realize just what damage they could be doing. So absolutely, we need to get away from it, because it is hampering that stigma is actually hampering our diagnosis. What I would love to be able to do as a pediatrician is to, come up with some kind of test, which you do the test, it tells you whether a child was exposed to alcohol in pregnancy or not, and then you can move on from there. But that doesn't exist. People have worked on it. I think there's still work being done on it, but that doesn't exist. So we are still very, very reliant on being able to report, and really the more we can take away the stigma and the blame, because this is not about judgment. This is not about blame. In as much as we want to prevent FASD from happening, we also want to get away from vilifying or sort of blaming individuals who have had children with or who have drank alcohol. And when people start to perceive that the stigma is going away, then I believe there will be even more reporting that can help us.
And of course, that relationship between the midwives and the health visitors with the pregnant mothers, there will be many mothers out there that would fear this because they discovered they're pregnant, and they might have been drinking even a little bit or a larger amount. We at the training that we did with the upskilling of the community paediatricians here in the Southeast, one of the things that Raja was mentioning was about how we view alcohol as a culture in this country, but also when we report how much we drink as well. I can go down, I can have a pint of beer, and in that pint of beer, I might have a 3.6%. I might have a 5.6%. That differential, but I just claim that I've had a pint of beer. And the same with alcohol across the board. So what is a safe level?
There is no safe level.
Thank you.
For quite a few reasons, there is no safe level. We know that alcohol affects the fetus throughout, pregnancy. So there isn't even a safe time to drink alcohol. And we know that even, for example, there's a study that said that even individuals who drank less than 2 units a week still had an impact on the fetus, still caused low birth weight, and still they were more likely to have premature deliveries. So even very small amounts can still have an impact. And also, we all metabolize alcohol very differently. Just like we metabolize drugs differently, as in, medicinal drugs differently, we all metabolize alcohol very differently, because sometimes, the argument is, oh, well, someone down the road, that I know had alcohol, their babies turned out fine. That doesn't mean the same is going to happen for, as an individual. And even what we're realizing is that, what is that definition of fine? Really, by the time you start to assess, you're likely to find, you could find something that is linked to FASD. So really, the consensus all around the world, and we were late to catch on in the UK, but the consensus all around the world is abstinence.
Yes.
And really, that is the safest way to protect your baby is to abstain. But it is also said that if some people do fall pregnant without realizing, but as soon as you realize that you are pregnant, then the evidence states that if you stop at that level, you actually reduce the severity of any effects that you get.
Brilliant. Thank you for clearing that up. Now, I like to finish on a high always in these, because there is a lot of people see doom and gloom around this, but there are some fantastic stories that we've come across. One of the reasons that Tracy Allen set up this charity in the first place, FASD Awareness, was because of her struggles finding answers, and also for her lack of knowledge. At that time, all of us came in with virtually no information. And it was, you know, yourself, and we've heard today on our support group, online support group today, there are two other families there that see you as their guardian angel, because they saw you and you had the support, you had the wherewithal to be able to help and sympathize and educate and give them hope as well, and put support with the right level of support around them. Now, there aren't that many other pediatricians within the country that have that experience, and we've come across so many stories where many families have got through to that community pediatrician, and yet they don't understand FASD sufficiently. We are in a lot more exciting times here. You mentioned about sign guidance from Scotland, and we mentioned about the NICE guidance coming out later this year. Now, part of that, the clinical commissioning groups that fund organizations within the NHS, they've had to listen, they've had to take this on board, and lots of charities like ourselves up and down the country have been really talking to a lot of these CCGs and trying to get them to develop pathway plans. At the moment, there's only one clinic in this country, isn't there? As part of the NHS, which is Rogers, which does diagnosis, and of course they're inundated with cases. Now, I mentioned this to you the other day, and are there any private companies around that you know about that diagnose? And if so, is it taken as a serious diagnosis, or, you know, what's
I mean, personally, I haven't had any interaction with. I am aware that there might be one or two, but really it's not really in the mainstream. The problem is, with anyone who is going into this field is going to be subscribing to the correct, or the accepted, I should say, clinical guidelines. And I think, that gives you credibility, and that gives you sort of validity to the actual diagnosis. And this is why it's so important that the NICE guidance does come out. I know there's been a few delays at the moment, but it's so important that they do come out so that we know what the benchmark is, and we know, where, we are going to be singing from in terms of the hymn sheet. I mean, and I think these are exciting times. If I could just digress slightly, because we've always kind of thought that FASD was equal or the same as FAS, and it's not. And we've always thought that we needed to have huge setups in order to diagnose FASD. And what is emerging now with the exciting things that we're doing here in the southeast is that that need not necessarily be the case. So we're going from looking at this from a point of view of obstacles, so actually seeing the solutions, and stand to open things up a little bit more. And I foresee probably in the next, within the next five years, we will have more diagnosis coming through. We would have more proper assessments being done. And I think there are moves afoot in terms of training, in terms of because one of the issues where a pediatrician like myself may be less comfortable is because we haven't had the training. The training we've had in medical school really just talks about the genetic side or the dysmorphic side of FASD. And once we don't see that, a lot of us haven't really looked any further. And the evidence is pointing us actually to look a little bit further, to delve a little bit deeper. And I think, with the exciting stuff that's happening here in the Southeast, and also let's not forget Manchester, there's a lot of good work that's happening in Manchester and Scotland. I think
CCGs around the country are watching and listening to see how it works.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to come on to that point, because there'll be many other professionals that come into contact with FASD, and they might well be saying, well, that's great. All of a sudden, we're going to have a lot more diagnosis of FASD. What's the infrastructure to support that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that CCGs need to not just look at the diagnostic. And one of the exciting things I'll just quickly say in down south in the Southeast is the CCGs have taken an approach of looking at prevention, looking at manpower, looking at diagnosis, and looking at management, as it were. And all those things need proper assessment. I don't think I can't say that we are we've got it all sewn up and wrapped up yet, but you've got to look at all those areas almost simultaneously, because then you could have lots of diagnosis, and then not a great deal of post-diagnostic support. But at the same time, you can't stop making diagnoses and saying, oh, there's nothing else we can do, because there is, by virtue of actually assessing a child through those domains that I talked about earlier on, you start to identify their profile of need. And a standard teacher at in a primary school can understand those profile of needs, and they can start to put things in place to support and to help this child. And really, the parents, whether you're an adoptive parent or whether you are a birth parent, somebody affirming you and saying, actually, you're not going crazy. Your child has these issues. That is the first step to actually getting the answers, getting the support that you need. So yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Soji. I think it's a perfect time to be able to sort of sum up and just say that part of the training, part of the education, there are lots of professionals that feel that they need this education. We here at FASD Awareness do educational films as part of our Be Aware campaign and training, and we try and we offer training as well. But there are other organisations up and down the country, NOFAS, the Hub, FASD Hub Scotland, Manchester team, Salford, all the information at the moment. There's a lot of information, a lot of amazing work being set out by the UK Alliance, FASD Alliance. There are so many amazing people doing some great work, and a lot of ambassadors and advocates being able to come out and express their feelings as well, to be able to educate as many people so that when these pathway plans are set up, we have the right level of support. Absolutely. Because this is what we wanted to stress, wasn't it? At the beginning, you mentioned with early diagnosis, there are positive outcomes for Absolutely. Individuals and families living with FASD. We adapt the way that we work and we adapt the way that we think. And when people in education, professionals in healthcare, when they start to adapt their way of thinking, it leads to positive outcomes. Communication is better, more successful.
Absolutely. And
we don't have these stories of, the risks and the vulnerabilities and the negative outcomes that we've heard. Dr. Soji, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone's found that fascinating. We are in developing times. They, as Soji said, they're exciting times. Yes. I hope this darkness that has lived with so many families for so long, we're coming out into the light a little bit more, and there's more positivity. So please do share. If you can do anything right now to make an impact, share social media, share our films, if you like, which educate so many people. Soji mentioned about the what alcohol can do to a fetus. That was our latest film that we've put out, but also avoid that stigma and blame where we talk about why women might have drank alcohol during pregnancy and avoiding that. And if you want to know a little bit more about just what FASD is, have a look at our film on Be Aware campaign as well. Soji.
And now just to say that on the point of judgment and stigma, there's a lot of training that's available about how you ask, a lot of advice about how you can ask about alcohol use in a sensitive way, in a way that doesn't, put the backup of a parent. So, I would urge anyone who's involved or thinking about being involved in diagnosis and diagnostic assessment to, pay close attention to, to training. And we need more people who are interested, who are who want to, you know, make a difference in individuals' lives in this field, certainly. And you know, it's been a privilege for me to be able to do that, you know, with different individuals, and you can see, you know, the impact, you know, firsthand impact of what diagnosing has, you know, has made. Absolutely.
Well, I just think we can sum up with I've just noticed on the chat here, the final comment that I'm going to read out for everyone is, thank you for giving me hope, from an adoptive mum. So we thank you. Wish you all a very good night, and we'll see you next time next month. All the best. Thank you, Soji.
Pleasure.
Bye.